Dr. Alistair Finch's hands, once the most celebrated surgical instruments in 3 counties, now betrayed him. A tremor, a ghost of the carriage accident that had shattered his wrist, made them unfit for the delicate art of healing. He had retired in disgrace to a quiet, dusty town at the edge of nowhere, a man whose purpose had been stolen from him. His sprawling house, once a symbol of his success, was now a silent museum of a life that was over. He didn't heal people anymore. He just waited, surrounded by medical texts he could no longer use and the bitter taste of failure. He was a physician who couldn't fix himself. One night the town sheriff brought him a patient he couldn't refuse. A girl, a dancer from a traveling troupe whose wagon had overturned on the pass. Her name was Serafina, and her leg was brutally broken. But it was her eyes that held Alistair captive. They were the eyes of a wild bird with a broken wing full of fire defiance and a terrifying despair. The troupe had moved on, leaving her behind with a few coins and a note of apology. She was alone, crippled in a town she didn't know. Alistair set her leg with his old methodical skill, his hands blessedly steady for the rough work. But he knew the fine bones would never heal perfectly. She would never dance again. He offered her a room in his large empty house for her recovery, a clinical act of charity for a case he already considered a failure. He thought he was mending a broken bone. He didn't realize he was about to begin the far more complicated work of mending a broken soul, both hers and his own. Serafina was a difficult patient. She raged against her own body with a silent, simmering fury. She refused his help, trying to move on her crutches with a reckless impatience that threatened to undo his work. She would sit for hours by the window in her room, staring out at the world she could no longer be a part of. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Her silence was not gentle. It was a blade. "You must be still," Alistair would tell her, his voice clipped and professional. "The bone needs time." "Time is a luxury I don't have, Doctor," she retorted one day, her voice sharp with unshed tears. "A dancer who cannot dance is just a woman taking up space." Her words were a mirror, reflecting his own uselessness back at him. He was a surgeon who could not operate. They were two sides of the same broken coin, trapped in a house of quiet resentment. He retreated to his study, surrounding himself with the ghosts of his former prowess. He told himself he was merely her physician. Her spirit was not his concern. But he found himself listening for the sound of her crutches on the floorboards, a slow, halting rhythm that echoed the tremor in his own hands. They were both broken instruments left to gather dust in the silence. The days that followed settled into a cold, silent war. Alistair retreated to the fortress of his study, the door firmly closed. He surrounded himself with his books, their pages filled with the knowledge his hands could no longer enact. He traced the anatomical drawings with a trembling finger, a self-inflicted torture. He was a general studying old battle maps long after the war had been lost. The only intrusion was the sound from her room, the slow, agonizing thump-scrape of her crutches as she forced herself to move a sound that echoed the unsteady beat of his own damaged heart. Serafina, meanwhile, treated her recovery not as a process of healing, but as a battle against a betrayal. Her own body had betrayed her. She refused to be an invalid. Each morning, Alistair would leave a tray of food outside her door, oatmeal broth, dry toast, the clinical diet of a patient. And each evening, he would retrieve the tray barely touched. She was starving herself of comfort as if she didn't deserve it. He found her one afternoon collapsed on the floor of the long sunlit hallway. She had been trying to get to the parlor, to the window that overlooked the town, and had fallen. Her face was pale with pain and slick with sweat, but her eyes burned with a defiant fury. "Don't touch me," she hissed as he knelt beside her. Alistair's professional instincts took over, overriding his own detachment. "You've reopened the setting," he said, his voice sharp, pointing to the slight shift in her splint. You are being reckless. Do you want to be crippled for life? What's the difference? She shot back, her voice cracking. A dancer who cannot move is already a ghost. I'm just practicing. Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. A ghost. It was what he saw in the mirror every morning. A man defined by what he could no longer do. He didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He simply sat on the floor opposite her, the distance of the hallway between them. The tremor in my hand, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its professional authority. It started 2 years ago. The carriage went off the road near Blackstone Bridge. I was returning from a surgery in the capital. A new procedure, very complex. It was a success. He looked at his hand at the traitorous tremble. I broke my wrist in the fall. It healed. But the nerve remembers the shock. He met her gaze. I too am a ghost, Miss Serafina. I'm just better at haunting quiet rooms. It was the first piece of himself he had offered to anyone, a shard of his own brokenness. She stared at him, the fire in her eyes softening to a flicker of stunned recognition. They were not doctor and patient. They were two ghosts haunting the same house, and for the first time they were seeing each other clearly. His confession did not bring them closer, not immediately, but it changed the quality of the silence between them. The resentment that had been a sharp metallic taste in the air began to fade, replaced by a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual exile. Serafina began to eat the food he left for her. It was a small concession, a silent admission that her body at least deserved to survive. Alistair, in turn, found himself leaving his study door ajar. He started listening not just to the thump-scrape of her crutches, but to the other small sounds of her existence. The rustle of a page turning, the soft sigh as she looked out the window, the quiet, almost inaudible sniffle in the dead of night. He began leaving things on her food tray besides the bland meals. One day it was a book of poetry he hadn't opened in years. The next, it was a small polished geode from his collection, its crystalline heart a hidden, beautiful secret. He wasn't trying to heal her. He didn't know how. He was just offering pieces of a world beyond the four walls of her room. One morning, he found the empty tray outside her door as usual, but next to it, placed with deliberate care, was a single perfect white feather from a dove that nested in the eaves outside her window. It was her response, her own found object, her own piece of a world he in his study could not see. He picked it up, its lightness a profound weight in his trembling hand, and for the first time in a long time, the corners of his mouth twitched with the memory of a smile. A week later, he found her in the library. It was the first time she had ventured so far on her own. She was standing before a large leather-bound anatomy atlas that was open on a lectern. Her fingers were tracing the intricate drawings of the human leg, the muscles, the ligaments, the delicate, complex architecture of the very thing she had lost. "It's a marvel, isn't it?" Alistair said softly from the doorway. She didn't startle. She had heard him approach. "It's a betrayal," she whispered, her fingers stopping on the illustration of the ankle. All these perfect tiny pieces, all designed to work together, and one bad fall one moment, and the dance is over. He walked to stand beside her, looking at the drawing. "The dance changes," he said, more to himself than to her. He pointed with his trembling hand to the drawing of a hand. The same fingers that can perform a life-saving surgery can also play a sonata. The same hand that can hold a scalpel can hold a pen. He looked at her, his eyes full of a sad, hard-won wisdom. "The instrument is not the music, Miss Serafina. It is only the vessel." She was silent for a long time, her gaze lost in the lines of the drawing. "But what," she finally asked, her voice fragile, "is a vessel to do when it is broken?" Alistair didn't have an answer. He only knew that for the first time he felt a desperate, unprofessional urge to find one. The question of the broken vessel hung in the air between them for days. Alistair found himself unable to return to the quiet solitude of his study. He began to wander his own house, seeing it through her eyes. He saw the dust on the fine mahogany, the tarnish on the silver, the general air of neglect that had settled over everything like a shroud. This house was his vessel, and it too was broken. He started with the parlor, the room where his wife used to host parties filled with laughter and music. He pulled the heavy dust-laden sheets off the furniture, the act feeling like an exhumation. Sunlight thick with dancing dust motes streamed in, illuminating a room that had been asleep for years. Serafina, hearing the unaccustomed noise, hobbled to the doorway on her crutches. She watched as he single-handedly wrestled a heavy armchair back into its proper place, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "An experiment," he replied, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. "I'm testing a theory, to see if a room can remember how to be a room." She said nothing, but she didn't leave. She leaned against the doorframe, a silent observer. He worked all afternoon cleaning, polishing, arranging. He wound the grandfather clock in the corner, and its slow, steady tick began to beat like a heart returning to life. When he was done, the parlor was transformed. It was still a room full of ghosts, but now they had a clean, sunlit space to wander in. He stood in the center looking at his work. His hand was trembling more than usual from the exertion. "It's clean," Serafina said, her voice soft. "It's a start," he corrected. He looked at the empty space where a piano might have sat. He looked at the bare floorboards where people once danced. But it's missing something. It's missing its purpose. That evening, he didn't retreat to his study. He brought a book into the parlor and sat in one of the restored armchairs, reading by the light of a freshly polished lamp. After a while, Serafina followed. She didn't sit, but stood by the large bay window looking out at the twilight. "When I danced," she said suddenly, her voice distant, "there was no pain, no memory, just the music." She paused. "It was the only time I felt whole. The music made me whole." Alistair looked up from his book. He saw her silhouette against the fading light, a figure of profound grace even on crutches. "My hands," he said, holding up his trembling one, "were the same. When I was in surgery, there was no tremor, there was no fear, just the work, the focus, the feeling of mending what was broken." He let his hand fall. "The work made me whole." They sat in the quiet, restored room, two broken vessels finally understanding that their wholeness had never truly been their own. It had belonged to the dance, to the work, and now that was gone. The question was no longer what a broken vessel could do. It was what could it become. The newly awakened parlor became their neutral territory. The next morning, Alistair found Serafina there, not by the window, but sitting in one of the armchairs. She had a small sewing kit in her lap, something she must have had in her bag, and she was meticulously mending a tear in the lace of one of the curtains. Her fingers, so used to the grand gestures of dance, moved with a surprising minute precision. They were nimble, sure, and steady. Alistair watched her for a moment, unseen from the hallway. He saw not a crippled dancer, but a pair of hands with an artist's grace. "The stitches are almost surgical," he remarked, finally stepping into the room. She looked up, not startled, but with a faint wry smile. "My mother was a seamstress. She said if I insisted on tearing my costumes with my wild dancing, I had to learn how to repair them." The smile faded. "It seems a more useful skill now." An idea, faint and uncertain, began to form in Alistair's mind. He went to his study and returned with a heavy leather-bound book. It was an old surgical text filled with detailed color plates of intricate suture patterns. He placed it on the small table beside her. "I was a terrible student of the suture," he confessed. "My mind understood the patterns, but my fingers were always too impatient, too clumsy. I was a surgeon of the scalpel, not the needle." He opened the book to a page showing a complex, beautiful stitch, a pattern like a delicate braid used for closing difficult wounds. "This one," he said, "is called the Knot of Apollo. It is designed to hold under immense pressure, yet leave the smallest possible scar. It requires a dancer's touch." Serafina stared at the drawing, her fingers tracing its intricate path in the air. She saw the rhythm in it, the flow, the controlled, precise choreography. It was a dance for the hands. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Because," Alistair said, looking at her steady, capable hands, then at his own trembling ones, "I believe a vessel can be repurposed. It does not have to be thrown away simply because its original function is gone." He paused his next words, feeling heavy with risk. "My hands can no longer do this work, but my mind still can. I have the knowledge, Miss Serafina, and you have the hands." The air in the sunlit parlor crackled with the weight of his proposal. It was absurd, a crippled dancer and a surgeon with a tremor. But it was also the first glimmer of a purpose, a path forward that neither of them had dared to imagine. She looked from the book to his face, at his earnest, desperate, hopeful eyes. He wasn't just offering her a new skill. He was offering her a partnership, a way to mend. "The scar," she said softly, "is always the strongest part of the skin once it is healed." She looked down at the book, at the beautiful, intricate knot. "Show me how to begin, doctor." Their lessons began that afternoon. The parlor transformed from a place of memory into a place of quiet, intense work. Alistair brought out his old surgical kits, the polished steel instruments glinting in the light. He gave Serafina scraps of leather and canvas to practice on materials that mimicked the resistance of human skin. He became the teacher he never thought he could be. He sat beside her, his voice low and patient, describing the theory behind each stitch, the precise angle of the needle, the exact tension of the thread. He couldn't guide her hand with his own. His tremor made that impossible. But he could guide it with his words, with his vast encyclopedic knowledge. Serafina, in turn, became a student of astonishing aptitude. Her body, trained for years to memorize complex choreography, translated that discipline to her hands. She learned to see the patterns not as a series of movements, but as a fluid dance. Her fingers, which had once commanded stages, now performed a different kind of art, a miniature, life-saving ballet on the head of a pin. The frustration that had been a constant, bitter presence in her began to recede, replaced by a deep, absorbing focus. She would work for hours, her brow furrowed in concentration, until the stitch was perfect. And with every perfect knot, she tied a knot of a different kind, seemed to loosen inside her. Alistair watched her, and a part of him that had been dormant for years reawakened. The joy of teaching, of passing on knowledge, of seeing a student not just learn but excel was a feeling he had forgotten. He found himself smiling a real unforced smile as she mastered a particularly difficult technique. Their partnership was a strange, beautiful symbiosis. His mind, her hands; his knowledge, her grace. One day she was practicing on a thick piece of hide. "The needle is dulling," she remarked without looking up. Without a word, Alistair went to the fireplace, took a small whetstone from the mantelpiece, and began to sharpen the tiny tip of the surgical needle. His hands trembled as he worked the task, requiring a steadiness he didn't have. It was clumsy, imperfect work. Serafina stopped her stitching and watched him. She saw the effort, the deep frustration on his face as he struggled with a task that should have been simple. She saw his shame. When he was finished, he handed the newly sharpened needle back to her. "It's the best I can do," he said, his voice tight. She took the needle. Then she reached out and gently, with a dancer's deliberate grace, placed her hand over his trembling one. "Alistair," she said, using his first name for the first time. "The sharpest blades need the steadiest hands to guide them. She looked at him, her eyes clear and full of a profound understanding. And the steadiest hands need the sharpest minds to give them purpose. His hand stilled under hers. In that moment, they were not a broken surgeon and a crippled dancer. They were two halves of a single extraordinary whole. The first test of their unlikely partnership came not from a textbook, but from a real crisis. A young ranch hand from a neighboring property was thrown from his horse, his arm torn open on a barbed wire fence. The wound was deep, ragged, and bleeding badly. They brought him to the doctor's house, the only medical help for 50 miles. The boy was laid out on the long dining table, pale with shock. Alistair's old instincts flared to life. He cleaned the wound with a brisk professional efficiency, his mind sharp and clear, assessing the damage. But when he picked up the surgical needle to begin stitching, his hand began to tremble violently. The sight of real living tissue, the weight of a life depending on his steadiness, brought all his demons rushing back. He couldn't do it. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. "I can't," he whispered, the words tasting like ash. He backed away from the table, the ghost of his failure looming over him. Serafina, who had been quietly preparing bandages, saw the look on his face. She saw his retreat. She put down the bandages and walked to the table. Her own leg ached a dull throb, but she ignored it. She looked at the terrified boy, then at the gash on his arm. She didn't see a horrifying wound. She saw a problem to be solved, a tear to be mended. She looked at Alistair, who was standing frozen in the corner. "Tell me what to do," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in his storm of self-doubt. "Alistair, guide my hands." Her voice cut through his panic. He looked at her calm, focused face, and something inside him shifted. He was not the surgeon anymore. He was the teacher, the guide. He took a deep breath. "All right," he said, moving to stand behind her, his voice regaining its authority. "The needle first. The subcutaneous fascia needs to be closed with an interrupted stitch to relieve tension. You start here." He pointed his own finger steady for a moment. She picked up the needle. Her hands, which had trembled with fear and rage for weeks, were now perfectly still. And so they began. It was a strange, intense ballet. He was the voice, the mind directing every move. "Now the skin," he would murmur. "Use the knot of Apollo we practiced. Keep the tension even. That's it. Perfect." She was the body, her hands moving with an intuitive grace and precision that was breathtaking to watch. They worked in perfect synchronicity, two artists creating a single masterpiece of healing. An hour later, it was done. The ragged wound was closed with a line of stitches so neat and fine it looked like a piece of delicate embroidery. The boy was bandaged safe and sleeping from a dose of laudanum. Alistair and Serafina stood in the quiet room, the adrenaline slowly fading. They were both exhausted, but it was the clean exhaustion of meaningful work, not the weary fatigue of despair. Alistair looked at the line of perfect stitches, then at her. "No surgeon in the capital," he said, his voice thick with awe, "could have done it better." Serafina looked down at her own hands as if seeing them for the first time. They could no longer fly across a stage, but they had just saved a life. They had danced, after all. She looked at Alistair, and a slow, radiant smile spread across her face. "We did it, Doctor," she said. "Yes," he replied, his own smile mirroring hers. "We did." Word of the ranch hand's miraculous recovery spread through the sparse community like a grass fire. They spoke in hushed, awed tones of the doctor's new method, of the strange, quiet woman with the dancer's hands who worked under his direction. They didn't understand it, but they understood the result. A wound that should have left a man crippled had healed into a thin, clean scar. People began to come. Not often, but when the need was great. An old farmer who had nearly lost a finger to a hay thresher. A child who had fallen from a tree. Each time the ritual was the same. Alistair would direct his mind, the brilliant, unflappable strategist. Serafina would execute her hands, the steady, graceful instruments. They became a local legend, the doctor with the trembling hands, and the dancer who stitched souls back together. The house, once a silent museum of failure, became a place of quiet, purposeful healing. The grand dining table was permanently converted into their operating theater. The parlor became a waiting room. The scent of antiseptic and clean linen replaced the smell of dust and decay. Their partnership extended beyond the medical. Alistair, rediscovering his purpose, found the tremor in his hands lessened in his daily life. He began to write again, not medical papers, but long, detailed letters to colleagues in the East describing their new techniques, arguing for a new kind of medicine where knowledge and delicate skill could be separated and then rejoined. Serafina, in turn, began to heal in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her leg was still weak, the limp a permanent reminder of her loss. She would never leap across a stage again, but she found a new kind of grace. She walked through the house with a quiet confidence. She designed and sewed her own clothes, her fingers creating dresses that were elegant and practical, accommodating her limp without hiding it. She also started to play the piano again. But the music was different. It no longer held the sharp edges of her rage and grief. It was softer, more complex, filled with the quiet strength of a woman who had found a new, more profound way to dance. One evening, Alistair came into the parlor as she was playing. He didn't interrupt, just stood listening. The melody was one of hope, of intricate pieces fitting together to create a beautiful whole. When she finished, she turned to him. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The operating theater, the applause of your students, the life you lost." He thought for a moment, looking around the room at the flowers she had placed on the mantel, at the medical book lying open on a chair, at her sitting at the piano. "I miss the feeling of being whole," he admitted, "of being useful." He looked at her, a deep, grateful warmth in his eyes. "You gave that back to me, Serafina." "No," she said, her voice firm. "We gave it back to each other." He walked over to the piano, his hand resting on the polished wood near hers. His hand was trembling slightly. Hers was perfectly still. They were a study in contrasts, a perfect, unlikely balance. And in the quiet of the parlor, surrounded by the new life they had built, they both knew they were more whole together than they had ever been apart. Years passed. The legend of the doctor and his assistant became a quiet, respected fact of life in the territory. Their home was no longer seen as a place of tragedy, but as a beacon of hope, a place where impossible healing happened. Serafina's limp never fully disappeared, but it became a part of her grace, a testament to her journey. She filled the house with life, with a sprawling garden of herbs for medicinal use. With curtains she sewed herself, and with the constant, beautiful presence of her music. Alistair's tremor never vanished, but it no longer defined him. He became known not as the surgeon who had failed, but as a brilliant medical mind, a teacher. He published papers in Eastern journals, co-authored by S. Moore, her mother's maiden name, a quiet tribute to the woman whose hands gave his knowledge form. Their work started a quiet revolution in the field, a new way of thinking about skill and partnership. One cool autumn afternoon, Alistair found Serafina on the porch, watching the leaves fall. He came and sat beside her, a comfortable silence settling between them, a silence now filled with years of shared work, mutual respect, and a deep, unspoken love. He was holding a small, velvet-lined box. He opened it and held it out to her. Inside was not a ring, but a set of exquisite, custom-made surgical instruments. They were smaller, more delicate than standard tools, forged from the finest German steel with handles of polished ivory designed to fit her hands perfectly. Serafina gasped, her fingers tracing the beautiful, deadly sharp tools. "A dancer needs the right shoes," Alistair said softly, "and an artist. An artist deserves the finest brushes. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him. It was the ultimate acknowledgement of her skill, her worth, her new identity. "Alistair," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He gently took her hand, the one that had learned to mend flesh instead of flying through the air. "I am a physician, Serafina," he said, his voice steady, his eyes holding hers. "It is my job to diagnose, and my diagnosis is that my life is critically deficient in one area." He paused. A permanent partner. He didn't have a ring to offer. He had something better. He had a shared future, a shared purpose. Serafina laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed through the quiet afternoon. She leaned in and kissed him a kiss that was not about passion, but about a profound and perfect partnership. They were never the toast of the capital. They never received grand accolades. But in a quiet house at the edge of nowhere, the doctor with the trembling hands and the dancer with the broken leg found a way to do the impossible. They didn't just mend torn skin or set broken bones. Together, hand in hand, mind to mind, they had learned the far more delicate and beautiful art of mending a soul.